The October wind carried an unnatural chill across Whitmore Plantation, cutting through the humid Alabama air like a blade forged in winter's heart. In the slave quarters, where weathered wooden walls barely held back the elements, Adeline gripped the rough-hewn bed frame as another contraction tore through her 17-year-old body. "Push, child, push," urged Mama Ruth, the plantation's midwife, her weathered hands steady despite the tremor in her voice. At 63, she had delivered more babies than she could count, but tonight felt different, wrong. The temperature in the cramped cabin had dropped so suddenly that their breath now formed visible clouds. The other women huddled closer to the dying fire, their eyes wide with an ancient fear that ran deeper than their understanding. "Something ain't right," whispered Sarah, Adeline's closest friend, pulling her thin shawl tighter. "Feel that cold? It ain't natural." Then came the sound, distant at first, like church bells carried on an impossible wind. But there was no church for miles, and certainly no bells that would ring at this ungodly hour. The sound grew clearer, more insistent, as if summoning something from beyond the veil of the living world. Adeline's scream pierced the night as the final contraction seized her. In that moment, as her child entered the world, the temperature plummeted further, and the bell-like sounds reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. The baby's first cry was unlike anything Mama Ruth had ever heard, not the typical wail of a newborn, but something that seemed to resonate with frequencies that touched the soul. It was beautiful and terrible, innocent, yet ancient. As the sound faded, an eerie silence fell over the plantation. Even the crickets had stopped their nightly chorus. "Lord have mercy," Mama Ruth whispered, cradling the perfectly formed baby boy. His skin was the color of rich mahogany, his eyes already alert and strangely knowing. "What have we brought into this world?" Outside, Master Whitmore stood on his grand porch, having been awakened by sounds he couldn't explain. The wealthy plantation owner, a man who prided himself on rational thought and southern pragmatism, found himself shivering in the inexplicable cold. "Margaret," he called to his wife, who had appeared beside him in her nightgown. "Did you hear those bells?" Margaret Whitmore, a delicate woman from Charleston society, nodded slowly. "They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, Thomas. What could it mean?" Before he could answer, they heard it, the baby's cry drifting across the plantation grounds. It was hauntingly beautiful, yet it filled them both with an inexplicable dread. In the slave quarters, Adeline held her son close, tears streaming down her face. She had felt something during the birth, something that connected her child to forces beyond her understanding. The other women watched in awed silence as the baby settled into peaceful sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with perfect rhythm. "What will you name him?" Mama Ruth asked softly. Adeline looked down at her son, seeing something in his dark eyes that spoke of wisdom far beyond his minutes of life. "Ezekiel," she whispered, "like the prophet who saw visions." As dawn approached, the unnatural cold finally began to lift, but the memory of that night would haunt everyone who experienced it. None of them knew that this was only the beginning, that little Ezekiel's cries would soon herald events that would challenge everything they believed about life, death, and the thin boundaries between worlds. The plantation's overseer, Jake Morrison, made his usual morning rounds, unaware that the natural order of his world had shifted forever in the darkness of a slave cabin. As he walked past the chicken coop, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Every single chicken lay dead, their bodies unmarked but lifeless, as if their souls had simply departed during the night. 3 days had passed since Ezekiel's birth, and Whitmore Plantation had settled into an uneasy routine. The dead chickens had been explained away as disease, though no one could identify what illness could kill so cleanly and completely. Master Whitmore had ordered the coop burned and new birds purchased from a neighboring farm. Adeline kept her son close, nursing him in the relative privacy of her cabin while the other women went about their daily tasks. She had noticed something troubling. Whenever Ezekiel cried, which was surprisingly infrequent, a strange stillness would fall over their surroundings, as if the world itself held its breath. "That child barely makes a sound," observed Mama Ruth, checking on mother and baby. "Most newborns cry near constant, but little Ezekiel here seems content as can be." Adeline nodded, though worry creased her young face. "It's like he knows something we don't, Mama Ruth. The way he looks at things, it ain't natural for a baby." In the main house, Dr. Henry Caldwell had arrived from Montgomery at Master Whitmore's urgent request. The physician, a man of science and reason, had come to investigate reports of unusual occurrences on the plantation. At 45, Dr. Caldwell had built his reputation on rational explanations for seemingly inexplicable phenomena. "Thomas, you summoned me here to investigate dead chickens," Dr. Caldwell asked, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles as he examined the burned remains of the coop. "It's not just the chickens, Henry," Master Whitmore replied, his usual confidence shaken. "There have been other things. Strange sounds, unnatural cold, and the slaves are talking about that baby born 3 nights ago, Dr. Ma." Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "A baby? What possible connection could an infant have to dead livestock?" Before Master Whitmore could answer, a commotion erupted from the fields. Jake Morrison came running toward them, his face pale with panic. "Master Whitmore, you need to come quick. It's old Pete, he's dead." They rushed to the cotton fields where a crowd had gathered around the body of Pete Williams, a 60-year-old slave who had worked the plantation for over 3 decades. He lay peacefully among the cotton plants, his face serene, showing no signs of struggle or illness. "What happened?" Dr. Caldwell demanded, kneeling beside the body. "Nobody knows, sir," replied Samuel, one of the field hands. "Pete was working fine this morning, singing like he always does. Then we heard a baby crying from the quarters, and when it stopped, Pete just laid down and died." Dr. Caldwell frowned, checking for pulse and examining Pete's eyes. His heart simply stopped. No apparent cause. Sometimes older individuals suffer sudden cardiac events, though this is remarkably peaceful for such an occurrence. But the slaves exchanged knowing glances. They had heard the baby's cry, felt the familiar chill that accompanied it, and watched as life simply left old Pete's body. That evening, as Dr. Caldwell documented his findings in Master Whitmore's study, another incident occurred. Young Timothy, the Whitmore's prize bull, was found dead in his pen. Like Pete and the chickens before him, there were no signs of violence or disease, just the peaceful stillness of death. "This is becoming a pattern," Dr. Caldwell murmured, reviewing his notes. 3 separate incidents, all following the same mysterious circumstances. Margaret Whitmore entered the study, her face drawn with worry. "Henry, the slaves are saying it's connected to that baby. They claim every time he cries, something dies." Dr. Caldwell scoffed. "Superstitious nonsense, Margaret. There must be a rational explanation, perhaps some kind of disease we haven't identified, or environmental factor affecting the plantation." But even as he spoke, doubt crept into his scientific mind. The timing was too precise, the deaths too clean. In his years of medical practice, he had never encountered anything quite like this. In the slave quarters, Adeline rocked Ezekiel gently, singing a low lullaby her own mother had taught her. The baby gazed up at her with those impossibly knowing eyes, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What are you, my sweet boy?" she whispered. "What did the spirits send me?" As if in response, Ezekiel made a soft cooing sound. Not quite a cry, but enough to make every person on the plantation pause in their evening activities, waiting with held breath for what might come next. The night passed without incident, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the baby's true cry would be heard again, and when it was, death would surely follow. Dr. Caldwell had been on Whitmore Plantation for a week, and his scientific certainty was crumbling like autumn leaves. He had conducted thorough examinations of every death, tested the water supply, analyzed the soil, and even examined the air quality. Every rational explanation led to a dead end. The pattern had become undeniable. In the past 7 days, Ezekiel had cried exactly 4 times, and each cry had been followed within minutes by a death. Old Pete, the bull Timothy, a barn cat named Whiskers, and most recently, a field hand named Moses, who had simply collapsed while picking cotton. "This is impossible," Dr. Caldwell muttered, pacing his temporary quarters in the main house. His medical journals lay scattered across the desk, filled with notes that defied every principle of science he held dear. Master Whitmore knocked and entered, his face haggard from sleepless nights. "Henry, we need to discuss the baby. The slaves are terrified, and frankly, so am I." "Thomas, you're a rational man. Surely you don't believe an infant is somehow causing these deaths?" "I don't know what to believe anymore," Master Whitmore admitted. but I know what I've observed. Every time that child cries, someone or something dies. The timing is too precise to be coincidence. Dr. Caldwell had reached the same conclusion, though his scientific training rebelled against it. I need to examine the child myself. Perhaps there's something medical, a condition that could explain this phenomenon. The slaves won't like it, Master Whitmore warned. They're protective of the mother and baby. Some are saying the child is blessed by their African spirits. And others? Others think he's cursed. That afternoon, Dr. Caldwell made his way to the slave quarters, his medical bag in hand. The usual chatter and activity ceased as he approached, replaced by wary silence. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts, and the men watched him with guarded expressions. Mama Ruth emerged from Adeline's cabin, her ancient eyes filled with a mixture of respect and suspicion. "Dr. Mann, what you want with our baby?" "I'm a physician, ma'am. I simply want to ensure the child is healthy." "That baby don't need no examining," Mama Ruth said firmly. "He's perfect as the day he was born." "Please," Dr. Caldwell said, softening his tone, "I'm not here to harm anyone. I just want to understand what's happening." After a long moment, Mama Ruth stepped aside. "You can look, but you don't touch, unless Adeline says so." Inside the dim cabin, Dr. Caldwell found Adeline sitting on her narrow bed, cradling Ezekiel. The young mother looked up at him with eyes that held both fear and fierce protectiveness. "Ma'am," Dr. Caldwell said gently, "I'd like to examine your son, if you'll permit it." Adeline studied his face for a long moment. "You the doctor been asking questions about my baby?" "I am. I'm trying to understand some unusual occurrences on the plantation." "You mean the dying?" Adeline said quietly. "You think my baby causing it?" Dr. Caldwell was struck by her directness. "I'm trying to find a medical explanation for what's been happening." Adeline looked down at Ezekiel, who was awake and alert, his dark eyes seeming to focus on the doctor with unusual intensity. "You can look at him, but I'm telling you now, there ain't nothing wrong with my child. He's special, but he ain't sick." Dr. Caldwell approached slowly, setting his bag on the floor. As he drew near, he felt an odd sensation, a slight drop in temperature and a tingling in the air, as if the atmosphere itself was charged with some invisible energy. Ezekiel was indeed a beautiful baby, perfectly formed and healthy in every visible way. His skin was smooth and unblemished, his breathing steady and strong, but there was something in his eyes, an awareness that seemed far beyond his weeks of life. "May I listen to his heart?" Dr. Caldwell asked. Adeline nodded reluctantly. As the doctor placed his stethoscope on the baby's chest, he heard something that made him freeze. The heartbeat was normal in rhythm and strength, but underneath it, almost imperceptible, was another sound, like a distant echo or harmonic that shouldn't exist. "Remarkable," he whispered. "What is it?" Adeline asked, alarm creeping into her voice. "His heart. It's perfectly healthy, but there's an unusual acoustic phenomenon, almost like..." He paused, struggling to find words for something beyond his medical training. As if responding to the examination, Ezekiel began to fuss, his tiny face scrunching up in preparation for a cry. The temperature in the cabin dropped noticeably, and Dr. Caldwell felt a chill run down his spine. "Please," he said urgently to Adeline, "try to keep him calm." Adeline immediately began humming a soft melody, rocking Ezekiel gently. The baby settled, but not before releasing a brief, soft cry that seemed to resonate in frequencies that touched something deep in Dr. Caldwell's soul. Outside, they heard a commotion, shouts and running footsteps. Dr. Caldwell's blood ran cold as he realized what had happened. "Stay here," he told Adeline, grabbing his bag and rushing outside. He found a crowd gathered around the plantation's blacksmith shop. Inside, they discovered Jeremiah, the plantation's skilled metalworker, slumped over his anvil. Like all the others, he showed no signs of violence or struggle, just the peaceful stillness of death. Dr. Caldwell checked for vital signs, knowing already what he would find. Nothing. Jeremiah was gone, and the timing coincided perfectly with Ezekiel's brief cry. As he stood over another inexplicable death, Dr. Caldwell realized that his scientific worldview was about to be shattered completely. Whatever was happening here defied every law of nature he understood, and he was beginning to suspect that some mysteries were beyond the reach of medical science. The slaves watched him with knowing eyes, their faces reflecting a mixture of sorrow for Jeremiah and a growing certainty that little Ezekiel was connected to forces far older and more powerful than any white doctor could comprehend. The death of Jeremiah marked a turning point on Whitmore Plantation. The skilled blacksmith had been respected by both slaves and masters alike, and his sudden, inexplicable death sent shockwaves through the entire community. Dr. Caldwell found himself caught between his scientific training and the mounting evidence that something beyond rational explanation was occurring. That evening, as the plantation settled into an uneasy quiet, Dr. Caldwell sought out Mama Ruth. He found her sitting on the porch of her cabin, smoking a corn cob pipe and staring into the darkness with eyes that had seen too much. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "might I speak with you?" Mama Ruth looked up at him, her weathered face unreadable in the lamplight. "Dr. Mann want to talk to old Ruth? That's a first. I need to understand what's happening here. You've lived on this plantation longer than anyone. Have you ever seen anything like this before?" Mama Ruth took a long draw from her pipe, the ember glowing red in the darkness. "You asking if I seen death follow a baby's cry?" "No, sir. But I seen other things. Things that would make your book learning seem mighty small." "What kind of things?" "Sit down, Dr. Mann. This ain't a story for standing." Dr. Caldwell settled onto the porch steps, his medical bag beside him. Around them, the night sounds of the plantation created a backdrop of crickets and distant voices. "My grandmother, she come from the old country," Mama Ruth began, her voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. "Brought over on a slave ship when she was just a girl. She told me stories about the spirits that watch over our people and the powers that some children are born with." "Powers?" "In Africa, before the white men came with their chains, there were children born with the gift of sight. Children who could speak to the ancestors, who could call upon forces that bridge the world of the living and the dead." Dr. Caldwell felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "You believe Ezekiel has such abilities?" "I believe that baby is marked by something older than your medicine, Dr. Mann. The way he was born, with the cold and the bells that ain't there, that's the ancestors announcing a special child. But the deaths, maybe the child ain't causing them deaths," Mama Ruth interrupted. "Maybe he's just announcing them. Maybe he can see what's coming and his cry is a warning." This perspective had never occurred to Dr. Caldwell. A warning? "Think about it, Dr. Mann. Old Pete, he been sick for months, just hiding it good. That bull Timothy, he been favoring his left side. Jeremiah been complaining about chest pains. Maybe that baby can see death coming before it arrives." Dr. Caldwell considered this possibility. It would explain the timing without requiring him to abandon all scientific reasoning. But how could an infant possess such perception? "Some children are born with gifts," Mama Ruth said simply. "In the old country they would be trained by the wise women, taught to use their abilities to help their people. But here," she gestured around the plantation, "here, we just trying to survive." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Master Whitmore emerged from the darkness, his face grim. "Dr. Caldwell, I need to speak with you immediately." They walked back to the main house in tense silence. In his study, Master Whitmore poured himself a generous glass of whiskey before speaking. "I've been in contact with other plantation owners in the area. There are rumors, Henry. Stories about strange occurrences on plantations with large slave populations." "What kind of stories?" "Unexplained deaths, unusual weather patterns, slaves speaking of spirits and ancient powers. The war has everyone on edge, and now this." He gestured vaguely toward the slave quarters. Dr. Caldwell set down his own glass untouched. "Thomas, what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that perhaps we're dealing with something beyond our understanding. The slaves have their own beliefs, their own practices. What if this baby is somehow connected to those beliefs?" "You're talking about superstition." "Am I?" Master Whitmore interrupted. 5 deaths in 10 days, Henry. All perfectly timed with that infant's cries. At what point does coincidence become something else? Before Dr. Caldwell could respond, they heard it, a baby's cry drifting across the plantation grounds. Both men froze, their eyes meeting in shared dread. The cry was longer this time, more intense, filled with what sounded almost like anguish. It seemed to echo from every direction at once, penetrating the walls of the house and settling into their bones. When it finally faded, an oppressive silence fell over the plantation. No crickets, no nightbirds, no rustling of leaves in the wind. Just absolute, unnatural quiet. They waited, both men holding their breath, for news of another death. But minutes passed, then an hour, and no alarm was raised. Whatever Ezekiel had sensed this time, it hadn't yet come to pass. In her cabin, Adeline held her son close, tears streaming down her face. She had felt something during his cry, a vision, perhaps, or a premonition. Images of soldiers in blue uniforms, of fire and smoke, of changes coming to their world that would shake the very foundations of everything they knew. "What did you see, my baby?" she whispered. "What's coming for us?" Ezekiel looked up at her with those impossibly knowing eyes, and for a moment Adeline could swear she saw the reflection of distant flames dancing in their depths. The war was coming closer to Alabama, and with it, a reckoning that would test everything they believed about life, death, and the mysterious child whose cries seemed to herald the future itself. Dawn broke gray and ominous over Whitmore Plantation, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed to mirror the growing tension in the air. Dr. Caldwell had spent a sleepless night documenting his observations, trying to reconcile his scientific training with the increasingly undeniable evidence that Ezekiel possessed abilities beyond normal human understanding. The previous night's cry had been different, longer, more anguished, and filled with what could only be described as prophetic sorrow. Yet no immediate death had followed, leaving everyone on the plantation in a state of anxious anticipation. Master Whitmore found Dr. Caldwell in the study at sunrise, surrounded by scattered papers and empty coffee cups. "Any insights from your midnight research?" Master Whitmore asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I've documented everything, Thomas, but I'm no closer to a rational explanation. If anything, the evidence points towards something that challenges everything I thought I knew about the natural world." Their conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking at the door. Jake Morrison burst in without waiting for permission, his face flushed with panic. "Master Whitmore, sir, riders coming up the main road, looks like Confederate soldiers." Both men rushed to the front porch, where they could see a small contingent of gray-uniformed cavalry approaching through the morning mist. The lead rider carried a dispatch bag, and his grim expression suggested the news he bore was not welcome. Captain James Fletcher dismounted and approached the porch, his uniform dusty from hard riding. "Master Whitmore, I'm Captain Fletcher, Confederate Army. I have orders to requisition supplies and able-bodied men for the war effort." Master Whitmore's face paled. "Captain, surely you understand that my plantation requires a certain number of workers to maintain production." "I understand the war requires sacrifices from all of us," Captain Fletcher interrupted. "I need 20 of your strongest field hands, plus all available horses and a quarter of your stored grain." Dr. Caldwell watched the exchange with growing unease. Ezekiel's cry the night before suddenly took on new meaning. Perhaps the child had sensed not an immediate death, but the approaching disruption that would tear families apart and send men to die on distant battlefields. In the slave quarters, word of the soldiers' arrival spread quickly. Families huddled together, knowing that their men might be taken to build fortifications or serve as laborers for the Confederate Army. The work was dangerous, and many who were taken never returned. Adeline clutched Ezekiel closer as she heard the news. Her baby had been unusually restless since his cry the night before, as if he could sense the upheaval coming to their world. "Mama Ruth," she called softly, "what's going to happen to us?" The old woman's face was grave as she looked toward the main house, where the Confederate soldiers were conducting their business. "Change is coming, child. Big changes. Your baby, he knew it was coming." As if summoned by their conversation, Ezekiel began to fuss, his tiny face scrunching up in preparation for another cry. The temperature in the cabin dropped noticeably, and both women felt the familiar chill that preceded his supernatural vocalizations. "Hush now, baby," Adeline whispered urgently, rocking him gently. "Please, not now." But Ezekiel's distress seemed to grow, and despite his mother's efforts, he released another of his otherworldly cries. This one was different again, shorter but more intense, filled with what sounded like warning. The cry carried across the plantation grounds, reaching the ears of everyone present. Captain Fletcher's horse shied nervously, and several of his men looked around with obvious unease. "What in God's name was that?" Captain Fletcher demanded. Master Whitmore exchanged a meaningful glance with Dr. Caldwell. "Just a baby, Captain. Nothing to concern yourself with." But even as he spoke, they heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats, many horses moving fast. A cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, and soon they could make out the blue uniforms of Union cavalry. Impossible, Captain Fletcher breathed. There are no federal forces in this area. Dr. Caldwell felt a chill of recognition. Ezekiel's cry had been a warning. Union soldiers were approaching, and the small Confederate contingent was about to be caught completely off guard. "Captain," Dr. Caldwell said urgently, "I suggest you and your men take cover immediately." Captain Fletcher was already shouting orders to his troops, but it was too late. The Union cavalry, led by a determined-looking colonel, thundered into the plantation grounds with sabers drawn. The brief skirmish that followed was chaotic and violent. Gunshots rang out across the peaceful plantation as the two forces clashed. Master Whitmore and Dr. Caldwell took shelter behind the thick columns of the main house, watching in horror as the war they had heard about in distant dispatches suddenly arrived at their doorstep. When the dust settled, 3 Confederate soldiers lay dead, including Captain Fletcher. The surviving Confederates had been taken prisoner, and the Union forces now controlled Whitmore Plantation. Colonel William Hayes, the Union commander, approached the main house with a small escort. He was a stern-faced man in his 40s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "I am Colonel Hayes, United States Army," he announced. "This plantation is now under federal control. All slaves are hereby declared free under the authority of the United States government." The words hit like a thunderbolt. In the slave quarters, people emerged from their cabins with expressions of disbelief and dawning hope. Freedom, the word they had whispered in secret for generations, was suddenly being proclaimed by men with the power to make it real. Dr. Caldwell looked toward the slave quarters, where he could see Adeline standing in her doorway, still holding Ezekiel. The baby who had somehow sensed this moment coming was now witnessing the complete transformation of the world into which he had been born. As the implications of the Union occupation began to sink in, Dr. Caldwell realized that Ezekiel's supernatural abilities had revealed something profound. The child didn't just herald death. He could sense the great turning points of history itself, the moments when the old world died and a new one was born. The war had come to Alabama, and with it, changes that would reshape everything they thought they knew about their society, their beliefs, and the mysterious child whose cries seemed to echo the very voice of destiny. The Union occupation of Whitmore Plantation brought chaos that no one could have anticipated. Colonel Hayes had established his headquarters in the main house, while his troops set up camp in the fields where cotton had grown just days before. The transformation was swift and jarring, a world turned upside down in the span of a single morning. Dr. Caldwell found himself in an unusual position. As a physician, he was valuable to both sides, and Colonel Hayes had requested his services to tend to wounded soldiers. This gave him a unique vantage point to observe the dramatic changes unfolding around him. "Doctor," Colonel Hayes said during their first formal meeting, "I understand you've been investigating some unusual occurrences on this plantation." Dr. Caldwell was surprised by the colonel's knowledge. "How did you—" "Word travels, especially about strange happenings. My men are superstitious, and they've heard rumors about a baby whose cries predict death. I need to know if there's any truth to these stories." Dr. Caldwell chose his words carefully. "I've documented several unexplained deaths that coincided with the infant's vocalizations. The timing is remarkable. Remarkable enough to affect troop morale?" "Possibly." Colonel Hayes nodded grimly. "Then I need to understand what we're dealing with. Can you arrange for me to meet this child and his mother?" Meanwhile, in the slave quarters, now technically the freedmen's quarters, the reality of emancipation was proving more complex than anyone had imagined. While the legal bonds of slavery had been broken, the practical challenges of freedom in the middle of a war zone were overwhelming. Adeline sat in her cabin with Ezekiel, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. Mama Ruth sat beside her, her ancient eyes reflecting a mixture of joy and apprehension. "We're free, child," Mama Ruth said softly. "After all these years, we're finally free." "But what does that mean?" Adeline asked. "Where do we go? What do we do? This is the only home Ezekiel has ever known." "Freedom means choices, baby girl. Hard choices, but there are choices to make." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Caldwell, accompanied by a Union sergeant. The doctor's face was serious as he approached. "Adeline, the Union commander would like to meet you and Ezekiel. He's heard about the unusual circumstances surrounding your son." Adeline's protective instincts flared immediately. What does he want with my baby? He's concerned about the effect of rumors on his troops' morale. I've assured him that you and Ezekiel pose no threat, but he wants to see for himself. Mama Ruth stood slowly, her joints creaking with age. Dr. Mann, you tell that colonel that this baby is under our protection. He's been through enough already. I understand your concerns, Dr. Caldwell said gently, but refusing to meet with him might create more problems. The colonel seems reasonable, and he has the power to ensure your safety during this transition. After much discussion, Adeline agreed to the meeting, but only with Mama Ruth and Dr. Caldwell present. They made their way to the main house, where Colonel Hayes waited in what had once been Master Whitmore's study. The colonel was younger than Adeline had expected, with kind eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. He stood respectfully as they entered. "Ma'am," he said to Adeline, "I'm Colonel Hayes. I want to thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Adeline held Ezekiel protectively, studying the Union officer's face. "Dr. Caldwell says you want to see my baby. I've heard remarkable stories about your son, stories that, if true, suggest he possesses unusual abilities." "What kind of abilities?" Adeline asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. Colonel Hayes glanced at Dr. Caldwell, who nodded encouragingly. "The ability to sense when death is approaching, to warn of danger through his cries." As if responding to the conversation, Ezekiel began to stir in his mother's arms. The temperature in the room dropped slightly, and everyone present felt the familiar chill that preceded his supernatural vocalizations. "Please," Colonel Hayes said urgently, "try to keep him calm." But Ezekiel's distress was growing, and despite Adeline's soothing whispers, he released one of his otherworldly cries. This one was brief but intense, filled with what sounded like urgent warning. The cry had barely faded when they heard shouting from outside. A Union soldier burst into the room without ceremony. "Colonel, Confederate cavalry approaching from the south. Large force, maybe 200 riders." Colonel Hayes was already moving, his military training taking over. "How long until they arrive?" 20 minutes, sir, maybe less." The colonel turned to Dr. Caldwell and the others. "Get to the root cellar beneath the kitchen. Stay there until the fighting is over." As they hurried towards safety, Dr. Caldwell marveled once again at Ezekiel's supernatural awareness. The baby had sensed the approaching danger minutes before any human scout could have detected it. The battle that followed was fierce and prolonged. Confederate forces, led by a determined major seeking to reclaim the plantation, clashed with Hayes's Union troops in a running fight that raged across the grounds. The sound of gunfire and shouting echoed through the afternoon, punctuated by the screams of wounded men and horses. In the root cellar, Adeline held Ezekiel close while explosions shook dust from the ceiling above them. Other freed slaves had joined them in the cramped space, their faces reflecting the terror of being caught between two armies. "This is what freedom looks like," whispered Sarah, Adeline's friend. "This is what war looks like," Mama Ruth corrected. "Freedom. That's something we still got to fight for." When the battle finally ended, Union forces had held the plantation, but at a terrible cost. 17 soldiers lay dead, and twice that number were wounded. Dr. Caldwell emerged from the cellar to find his medical skills desperately needed. As he worked to save lives in the makeshift field hospital, he reflected on the day's events. Ezekiel's cry had warned of the Confederate attack, potentially saving many lives by giving the Union forces precious minutes to prepare. But the baby's abilities raised troubling questions. If he could sense approaching danger, what else might he perceive? And in a world torn apart by war, how many more warnings would his cries herald? That night, as Dr. Caldwell tended to the wounded by lamplight, he heard Ezekiel cry once more, a long, mournful sound that seemed to mourn not just the day's dead, but all the suffering that war brings to the innocent. The price of freedom, he realized, was being paid in blood, and the mysterious child whose cries echoed through the darkness seemed to understand that cost better than anyone. 3 months had passed since the Union occupation of Whitmore Plantation, and the war had moved on, leaving behind a transformed world. The plantation now served as a temporary settlement for freed slaves, with Colonel Hayes working to establish some semblance of order in the chaos of emancipation. Dr. Caldwell had remained to provide medical care for the community, but his true fascination lay with Ezekiel, whose abilities had only grown stronger with time. The baby, now 4 months old, had demonstrated an uncanny ability to sense not just death, but significant events that would reshape their world. Adeline had grown into her role as a free woman, though the responsibilities of freedom weighed heavily on her young shoulders. She had learned to read from a Union chaplain and was teaching other freed slaves, but her primary concern remained protecting her extraordinary son. "Dr. Caldwell," she said one morning as he examined Ezekiel during his regular checkup, "I've been thinking about what you said, about taking Ezekiel north to where there are people who might understand his gifts." Dr. Caldwell looked up from his examination. The baby was thriving physically, growing strong and healthy, but his eyes held that same otherworldly awareness that had marked him from birth. "The war is ending, Adeline. There will be opportunities in the north. Schools, communities where Ezekiel could grow up free and perhaps learn to understand his abilities. But what if his gift is meant for here, for our people, before Doctor?" Caldwell could answer. Ezekiel began to fuss, his tiny face scrunching up in the familiar pattern that preceded his supernatural cries. The temperature in the room dropped, and both adults felt the chill that had become so familiar. "Not again," Adeline whispered, trying to soothe her son. But Ezekiel's distress was different this time. Not urgent like his warnings of danger, but profound and sorrowful, as if he sensed some great tragedy approaching. His cry, when it came, was unlike any they had heard before. Long, mournful, and filled with what could only be described as national grief, the cry seemed to echo across the plantation and beyond, carrying on the wind like a lament for the entire country. When it finally faded, an oppressive silence fell over the settlement. "What could that mean?" Adeline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They didn't have to wait long for an answer. A rider approached the plantation at full gallop, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with terrible news. Colonel Hayes met him at the main house, and within minutes the word spread throughout the settlement. President Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. The news hit the freed slave community like a physical blow. Lincoln, the great emancipator, the man who had signed the proclamation that gave them their freedom, was dead. The future that had seemed so promising suddenly felt uncertain and frightening. Dr. Caldwell found Adeline sitting on her cabin steps, holding Ezekiel and weeping quietly. The baby was calm now, as if his prophetic cry had released the grief he had sensed approaching. "He knew," she said simply. "Somehow my baby knew that our Moses was going to be taken from us." "Adeline," Dr. Caldwell said gently, sitting beside her, "I think it's time we seriously discuss taking Ezekiel north. His abilities are remarkable, but they're also dangerous. There will be people who won't understand, who might see him as a threat. Or as something to be used," Adeline added, her protective instincts sharp as ever. Over the following weeks, as the nation mourned its fallen president and struggled with the challenges of reconstruction, Dr. Caldwell made arrangements for their journey north. He had contacts in Philadelphia, physicians and scholars who might be able to help them understand Ezekiel's gifts. The night before their departure, Mama Ruth came to say goodbye. The old woman, now in her 70s, had decided to remain on the plantation with the other elderly freed slaves. "You take care of that special baby," she told Adeline, pressing a small cloth bundle into her hands. "These are herbs from the old country, passed down from my grandmother. They'll help protect him when his gift becomes too strong. Mama Ruth, what do you think he'll become?" The old woman looked down at Ezekiel, who was awake and alert in his mother's arms. "I think he's going to be a bridge, child. A bridge between the world of the living and the world of the spirits, between the old ways and the new, between what was and what's going to be." As if understanding her words, Ezekiel made a soft cooing sound. Not a cry this time, but something almost like agreement. The next morning, Dr. Caldwell, Adeline, and Ezekiel began their journey north. As their wagon pulled away from Whitmore Plantation, Adeline looked back at the only home she had ever known. The slave quarters where Ezekiel had been born were already being torn down, replaced by small houses for the freed families who chose to stay. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked Dr. Caldwell. "I believe we are," he replied. "Ezekiel's gift is too important to be hidden away. The world is changing, and perhaps he's meant to be part of that change." As they traveled north through a landscape scarred by war but healing with the promise of freedom, Ezekiel remained unusually quiet. It was as if he understood that this journey marked the end of one chapter of his life and the beginning of another. Years later, Dr. Caldwell would write in his memoirs about the extraordinary child he had encountered in Alabama, the baby whose cries had heralded death, warned of danger, and mourned the loss of a president. He would describe Ezekiel as a prophet born in the crucible of America's greatest trial, a child whose supernatural gifts had emerged at the precise moment when the nation needed to confront its deepest truths about life, death, and the price of freedom. But that night, as they camped under the stars somewhere in Tennessee, Dr. Caldwell simply watched Adeline sing a lullaby to her son and marveled at the mystery of a child who seemed to carry the weight of the world's sorrows in his otherworldly cries. Ezekiel slept peacefully in his mother's arms, his breathing steady and calm. Whatever visions or premonitions filled his dreams, they remained his secret. But Dr. Caldwell had no doubt that this remarkable child would continue to touch the lives of everyone he encountered, carrying with him the legacy of a time when the impossible had become reality, and the cries of a baby had echoed the voice of destiny itself. The war was ending, but Ezekiel's story was just beginning, and somewhere in the darkness of the American night, the future was listening for the sound of his voice.